Okay, shall we Super Mario Brothers it?
Okay.
Okay. So 3. Well, I guess.
3, 2,
do we
1,
count down?
dun. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So you want me to do the count?
Yeah.
Okay. 3, 2, 1. Okay. I hope that worked.
I didn't do the last
Cool.
one, but that should work.
Okay. Well, when this is all fucked up, it's your fault. I just
Okay.
want you to know.
I'm sorry, Andre.
We cannot speak his name. He's just going to edit it out. Well, you know what? We can speak it as much as we want. Hey, Andre, how's it going? Yeah, Andre. Yeah.
So, Andre, we're just going to drop your name in random intervals, and you will have to find them. Because we are so thankful for the work that you're doing for us. Yeah.
We are, and it's not nice of us to harass you.
Absolutely not. Thank you, Andre, for your hard work. You are cool. Thank you very much.
I'm going to fucking harass you.
I will try to not stutter and speak very clearly and have an easy-to-edit voice. Shall we start?
Let's do it. Take us away, Dachz.
Welcome to Codex Rex. My name is Dachz, and I am your host.
And I am your co-host, Tyler.
We are making a podcast about video game history, and in each episode, one of us tells a story about some kind of video game related topic, and the other one listens and kind of gives their input. Is that right?
That's me. I'm the listener.
You are the input.
And it's a Dachz episode.
It is a Dachz episode.
I'm so excited. It's a Dachz episode. You know how long it's been? It's been forever. I'm so fucking excited.
I didn't have a lot of time for episodes, but I made one. Yeah. I made promises about doing one much earlier, but I only got to do it now. And actually, we are planning to release this on Christmas.
On Christmas. Okay.
So this is a Christmas episode.
It's a Christmas episode. Do you realize that puts our lovely editor on a deadline? Did you hear that?
Yeah. If it's not a Christmas episode, you can you can edit this out, and we can just say this is a winter solstice episode. Like around the time of the winter solstice, we also did an episode, and this also includes like everybody that does not celebrate Christmas. Like it's cool for everybody to celebrate winter solstice. Winter solstice is a cool thing, right?
Yeah, we could call it a holiday episode, or if it takes you even longer, we could just say this is an episode from when it was cold outside. It's a chilly episode. Brr. Oh wait, except. Dude, we have like an Australian demographic. Oh, shit.
It's not winter for them. You can.
Fuck. I'm sorry, Australia. I'm sorry. Okay, the world revolves around me in the United States.
Our southern aligned, our southern aligned friends.
That's right. Yeah. See, I guess Well, sorry. So, Dachz, what have you been up to?
I've been. You shall start. What have you been up to?
Okay, I could go on a long, winding tale about what's going on in my life, but honestly, I just want to talk about 3D printing. I got a 3D printer, and it's the fucking coolest thing ever.
Wait, let me. Is it like there's resin printers and there's the other ones, right?
Yeah, like a filament printer. So I have a resin
filament
printer.
Or a resin? A resin, yeah, resin.
Yeah,
printer,
resin. Yeah. A raisin printer. That's just grapes. You just let them dry out.
No, it lets them dry and then turns them into little figurines.
Yeah. No, so it's a resin printer, and luckily, here I'm going to name drop some people who listen to the podcast. Illicit Owl and Rousset have both been huge resources for me, and luckily where I'm living right now, I have a space where I can do that, and I have just been making all kinds of figurines. I've been making Christmas presents. I've been like, anytime I'm like, oh man, I really wanted that miniature, but I can't afford it. I'm like, oh, now it cost me 12 cents. Ha! Awesome. So nice. Like today, I fully 3D printed an entire small 40K army for Andrea, and we played her first game, and it was a blast. So that's been my main hobby recently.
That's really cool.
Yeah. What about you, man?
I've been doing a lot of reading for some reason. Like, do you know this meme about ask your boyfriend how often he thinks about the Roman Empire?
No, I don't know this meme. No, hit me with it.
I don't know how it started, but there's something that some women found out that their boyfriends basically constantly think about the Roman Empire. And
okay.
And why I'm mentioning it is because I really got into the Roman Empire, and I read like 5 different books about it, and I have like 3 YouTubers that I listen to, and I'm a huge nerd about the late Republic of the Roman Empire now. And this is really weird, and I don't know how this happened.
Listen,
I think it has procrastination reasons or something. I just wanted to avoid something else.
that is typically how my brain works when I have a million things going on too, right?
Yeah.
Like I'll be like, I've always wondered where the first, this is literally something I was Googling the other day. Here's your fun fact that has nothing to do with video games. Do you remember that like time in music where everybody would hide like a secret song at the end of a track? Or like at the end of a CD. It is thought that the first instance of that comes off of Abbey Road, the Beatles album, because an editor didn't like a transition between like as part of a song, and he cut it out and threw it at the end, and Paul McCartney loved it and kept it in there and thought it was funny, and then it became catchy and everybody did that. But anyway, that's the kind of dumb shit that I look up when I'm supposed to be doing other work, and then I'm like, Andrea, did you hear that? Did you hear about this thing at the end of Abbey Road? And she's like, did you do any of that stuff for your job apps or like anything? And I'm like, yeah. I'll send it. Look, it doesn't matter when they get the emails. Okay. This is important now.
Yeah.
So I totally get it. Yeah. I'm on there.
Is there any video games that you played recently?
Oh man. Okay. So interesting that you say that. So we haven't like put out an episode since like May because our lives have been insane. And so I started thinking like, what have I played between the last episode and this one? And so what comes to mind is I beat Soma. Have you played Soma?
Yeah, a long time ago.
Right, it's kind of it's an older one. I beat Soma and I really enjoyed sort of the existential dread that game brought about. I also beat the Final Fantasy VII remake, at least the first part.
Oh, nice.
That was a fun sort of romp for like fans of the series. I felt like maybe they stretched it out a little bit in some ways that they kind of maybe shouldn't have, but aside from that, it really felt, it was pretty cool. It was neat to see. Currently I'm churning through, I've been playing a lot of Darktide, which is sort of like the Warhammer version of Vermintide. I chip away at Octopath Traveler 2 like once every couple of days. That's pretty much what I'm up to. What have you played?
First my life had been eaten by Armored Core, and then my life got eaten by Baldur's Gate. So, that's the Armored Core I have entirely, like, completed in its entirety, and I can't play it anymore. It's done. I can't touch it. But Baldur's Gate is still chipping away at me, so that's good.
How much time did you put into Armored Core? I'm just curious, because it looks completely up my alley, and I'm worried that if I touch it, my life will crumble to bits, and I will be able to accomplish nothing.
Let me just check my hours. I think it's like 60 or 70, and I really try to go for completion.
Yeah.
I didn't get all the, like, there's like a rating system, I didn't get all the S ratings, but I just gave up at some point. It's 60 hours.
That's a pretty solid amount of time for a game.
It's a good amount of time for a game. But for Baldur's Gate, I'm not even half done with it, and I have 140 hours already.
Oh my god. Yeah, that sounds right. I saw that they like released like I don't know, honor mode or something, a hardcore mode, whatever it's called.
Yeah, I'm playing it right now. It's really cool.
Oh man, that seems really like scary in a way that I kind of like though, right? Like if you
it's really cool.
If you mess up, you mess up. That's it. Like
it makes the game really challenging. It's nice.
How cool. Yeah, I like it's so interesting because like you've jumped onto 2 big releases of the year, right? And it's cool. Yeah. It's cool to hear about those. So, okay. Well, some housekeeping things. If any of you want to get in touch with us, you can hit us up on, send us an email at codexrexpodcast@gmail.com. And you can find me on Twitch. I'm just Vegan Tyler on Twitch. And that's it. Perfect. You ready to start?
Do you think we should start the episode?
Dude, let's do it. I'm so excited. I'm so excited. It's a Dachz episode.
Okay, so for anyone new to the podcast, what you have to know about Dachz episodes, that is I sometimes do normal episodes where I actually talk about like the development of a game or something, but I'd also do episodes where I go into the deep basics of where certain video game concepts come from. And today is such an episode. If you were expecting like something like, well, how did they do Final Fantasy? It's not going to be like this. We're going to start like more than 100 years ago, and we're going to slowly work ourselves towards video games, and we actually only going to talk about video games for a very short time in this episode. And you will have to handle this. And for those who know and like my episodes, I think you will enjoy it, because it's an interesting thing that we're going to talk about. We start in Germany more than 200 years ago. And what you have to know about Germany, that it didn't exist more than 200 years ago. Before 1871, Germany was like, it wasn't a unified state. This means, as a country, it's like around 100 years younger than, for example, the United States. And it is not that much older than Australia. The region that we now recognize as modern Germany, it was like a complex mosaic of independent states, each with its own unique history, system of governance, and like also cultural identity and stuff like that. And this period, before 1871, is often referred to as the German Confederation, because it was like an alliance, but it was a loose alliance. However, the roots of this loose alliance, they can be traced back to something that is called the Holy Roman Empire. And this played like a significant role in shaping the state of Germany before 1871. And this Holy Roman Empire was like a sprawling and highly complex political entity, and it lasted for like more than 1,000 years. And it was led by someone that was called the Holy Roman Emperor. You're looking at me like, why am I talking? This is a video game.
No, I'm just laughing because I'm like, ask your co-host how much he thinks about the Holy Roman Empire.
More than you would think. And the Holy Roman, the Emperor, in German is referred to as Kaiser, which you guys maybe know as it actually traces back to etymologically to the word Caesar. Caesar led to Kaiser, and so the entire Holy Roman Empire actually traces itself back to the Roman Empire. There was also kind of always kind of a trace back to the roots of Europe, even like more than 1,000 years later. So this Holy Roman Empire included several different powerful kingdoms, and for example, Bavaria was a kingdom within the Holy Roman Empire, which I guess is the most well-known German state even today. But like other very influential members of the Holy Roman Empire and later of the Confederation were, for example, the Kingdom of Prussia. Not Russia, Prussia with a P, but also Austria, which is like its own country today. And also, like, not just kingdoms, but also like a duchy called Brunswick, but many, many more, like thousands of different little countries. And like one of the most important features of this Holy Roman Empire was its lack of a strong central authority. Like there was the emperor, but they didn't have any power. They were just like a representative role. And the real political power lay in the hand of the single states and of the rulers of the single states. Now, your question might be, why are we doing this epilogue? And the thing is that we are actually starting this episode in Prussia and not in Germany. And I want to use the right terminology. And I want you, like, I didn't want to say this episode starts in Prussia and all of you go, what the fuck is a Prussia? And like, will it be on Steam sale this autumn? No, Prussia was a former state in the German Confederation, and this is where our story starts.
How much do you think you could buy Prussia for on Steam?
I don't know, probably not much, because it doesn't exist anymore.
heavily discounted state that doesn't exist. I heard the developers abandoned it. Like, I wouldn't buy it.
They absolutely did. They merged it with Germany. Anyway, So we start out in Prussia, in the town of Dachz, in 1743, a bit less than 300 years ago. On the 8th of November, a child is born, and his name is Johann Christian Ludwig Hellwig. And
could you say that again?
Really Johann Christian Ludwig Hellwig.
Incredible.
Like 4 names. And since you Americans can't really say that, like you can't even say Johann, we will call him John. I think John is a good simplification.
Oh, Johnny boy. Johnny boy
Yes.
Ludwig.
Oh yeah, Ludwig. Very good, Tyler.
I did it.
Yeah. So John, he was kind of born into a humble family, and there's no problem with that per se, but except that there isn't really much anything written down about it, because he was a basic guy from a basic town doing nothing but basic things. But he did write a lot about his own adolescence later on. So we kind of have his autobiography to fill the gaps. We know that his dad was the mayor of the town he lived in, and both of his parents wanted him to get an education, so they sent him to school, which they didn't have to. There was no like mandatory school. And you have to know that school back then was something else. Like he had to learn Latin and biblical texts and songs, and it was based around discipline and memorization and punishment. It was a different kind of school, nothing that we can imagine. And not to delve too deep into this, but this rough contact with the education system would absolutely leave a mark on him. You know, like how we often go into how our video game developers enjoyed something as a kid, and then this hobby that we kind of figure out about them kind of goes full circle later on. Like we see something that they like to do, and then we find that their creation later on kind of we rediscover in the thing that they will give to us. And there's something that John loved to do as a kid, and we will find that in his later life. We know about it because he wrote it down, because he was a huge history nerd, and like he loved to read old history books. He read the scripts of Julius Caesar, the biography of Alexander the Great, and he was especially into stories about war. And he actually, he is described as a really pleasant person. But for some reason, I can't help but think that, like, teenage John as this kind of scary nerdy kid in school that you are kind of, like, you're kind of nervous about because they keep dropping the most obscure knowledge about human atrocities in the most inadequate situations. Were
you that kid?
I kind of, in my mind, we all knew that kid. Like he was the odd guy that never really fit in. But he liked to read Robinson Crusoe, which was a huge hit at the time by Daniel Defoe. And he did not only read about war. When he was 13, his hometown was actually occupied by anti-Prussian forces coalition. And when he was 16, the war was still going on. So he basically lived in war times for 3 years during his adolescence, during which he was sent to school in another town called Stettin. His dad wanted to continue his studies, and he wanted to focus on law more than, like in his old school, he would mostly learn about religion, and his dad wanted to learn more about law, because according to John, his dad wanted him basically to follow him in his footsteps, to become a government official. He wanted John to be like a government clerk.
Okay, so he wants him to work in the government, not like learn law to be a lawyer, let's say.
Yeah, it's basically learn how to work with legal texts. Yeah.
Okay.
And this change of focus would get John into contact with one of his greatest passions, which is mathematics. And of course, rather simple mathematics, but still, he was really into juggling of numbers and mathematical concepts. But there was also something else in this new town, and that was that there was a military regiment stationed in Stettin, and thus there was like constant military presence everywhere. And he would see military disciplinary measures out on the streets. Do you know what running the gauntlet is?
Okay, so I say that like phrase a lot, but I don't know that I've ever actually looked up where it comes from. Educate me, Papa Dachz. Tell me.
It's like a military term. And the Wikipedia definition goes like this. To run the gauntlet means to take part in a form of corporal punishment in which the party judged guilty is forced to run between two rows of soldiers who strike out and attack them with sticks or other weapons. And this would be, in German, this is called Spießrutenlauf, and John would have seen this regularly out on the streets. And this would be done until someone was dead. Like, they had to go back and forth between the soldiers until they were killed, and this was done to soldiers as punishment.
Oh, so what you said, like running the gauntlet, I was thinking it was like some kind of training exercise or something like that.
No, it's corporal punishment, a form of execution.
Wow. Okay, so just beaten to death with sticks,
or the weapons of the soldiers. Yes.
Okay. Well, that's kind of dark.
So, yeah, he's like as an adolescent, he would see executions of soldiers out on the streets, and for me, it's really hard to imagine this, like this visceral world a person like John lived in. Mm-hmm. Like, I can't really speak for you, but I do not think that we can know what it's like to be constantly confronted by this absolutely cruel and brutal world your entire life.
Yeah,
but you don't have to worry, because this is not some kind of villain backstory that I'm trying to paint here, because John will turn out just fine. But I think the fact that he did, in spite of all those things that he experienced constantly in his life, is kind of amazing.
I will say, though, as uplifting as that is, Johann Christian Ludwig Helvig is the fucking coolest villain name, and it also could be pretty much any bad guy in a 90s movie. So
I love how you looked up his name and now you can read it, and you did good pronunciation. I'm very proud of you.
I did take 1 year of German that I didn't really pay attention to in high school.
Nice.
Yeah.
So after finishing school in Stettin, he moves on and gets a degree in law, especially focusing on mathematics. But he also gets into biology, apparently doing like a little detour into entomology, which is like this science of insects. For some reason, he got into that for a while. I don't know. And during this time, John really struggled with money. But he got into the good graces, which was kind of like his pet peeve. He was good at getting in good graces with important people, which you will later see. He got into the good graces with the principal of the university and was basically just exempted from tuition, which was nice. He never had enough cash to go out, though, so he just spent all of his time still reading history books and studying math, like the nerd that he was.
I mean, that's all any academic can ask for, is to just get adopted by someone with money so that you can keep reading books.
Yeah.
Really cool. Hey, if any of you wants to adopt me, let me know.
People with money, please call this number to adopt this lonely, long-haired man that really requires time to read books, especially money to read books. You can feed him.
Please send your applications to codexrexpodcast@gmail.com.
Do you know these big bottles that hamsters get with a little metal ball in? They can put it onto your window, and you can get like little snacks, and then they can.
I get a window?
Yeah.
I can see the sun?
Yeah, sometimes.
That is a luxury. So that sounds great.
So John gets his degree, and he's like completely exhausted from it. And I think we can relate. Like academia took something out of him and spit it out, and he was just a husk of his former self. And he writes in his autobiography that he just got a simple government job at that time because that's what he qualified for, and he just wanted to regenerate for a while. And he didn't really want to be a government clerk forever. He wanted to become a teacher. And when he was 23, because he was 23 at the time, he became the private teacher in the household of a military general, teaching 2 boys in far more topics than he was taught as a kid. Like, he really gets into designing his own teaching materials, which actually does not go unnoticed by the father of the kids, because I think as a kid, he experienced such terrible teaching, such like just getting punished, having to memorize everything, that he kind of wanted to do better. And he put a lot of work into coming up with these tabular teaching formats that were easier to comprehend for children. And one thing that would happen as a private teacher, that he would basically have dinner with the family. And since the father of the family was a general, there would always be all kinds of military officers at the dinner table. And these guys, they would be talking about nothing else but soldiering and cannons and like military conversations every evening. But what kind of surprised John was that they also discussed mathematical problems. A lot like geometry. Which kind of makes sense because war is also a lot about like shortest path and circumference of things.
Sure. Even like you want to shoot a cannon. Do you know how to calculate where it will hit? You know, that kind of math matters.
And that's mathematics that you have to discuss. So kind of like he planned to impress them a bit. So he brushed up on his mathematics and he actually put up like little shows for them where he showed them how to calculate certain things. And he actually managed to get them impressed. So they actually started to purposefully come to him on purpose to consult him for mathematical problems that they faced in war or during their officers' exercises.
I want to make a bunch of math jokes here, but even with my PhD, I'm not confident enough to make fun math jokes. So this is the point where you would go, I would make a joke, and then you would go, good math joke, Tyler, and then we would laugh. What a good math joke. Oh.
Numbers. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, during this time, John's father retired.
Just keep going. Just ignore it. Ignore me.
So John's dad retired. And remember, John's dad wanted John to be a government clerk. And John's dad was asked, hey, do you have like a replacement for you? Like, can someone else just do your job? And his dad obviously wanted John to come back home and become like a mayor or any kind of government clerk. But John just refused. He was just, no, I've got a good job. I'm making connections here. I'm not going to come back home and do like city government clerk work for the rest of my life. He had his own plans. And he continued being a private teacher and a consultant. And there was one reason especially why he was so confident, because the general, his employer, he was so impressed with him that he introduced him to someone. He introduced him to someone called Prince Wilhelm. Prince Wilhelm was an actual prince, and he was a man of culture, and he liked to surround himself with well-versed people.
He liked to surround himself with the worst people?
Like, I wanted to say well-versed people.
Oh, well-versed people. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Sorry, my pronunciation.
I mean, look, no, it's okay. I mean, also, like, you know, we're doing this over the internet because you're in Germany and I'm not.
Yeah.
And so sometimes things get a little garbled. But I was like, oh, man, he surrounded himself with the worst people. So why did he want old Johnny Boy then? He seems like an upstanding fellow. I understand now. Yeah.
Maybe he'll also surround himself with the worst of people, but we don't know about that.
We don't.
The thing is, the prince was so much into John and his math magic and his teachings that he actually wanted to be a student himself. And so all of a sudden, John was the teacher of a high-ranking nobleman. And
wow.
He literally teaches a prince and the kids of a general. And the prince actually wanted John to be his personal counselor. So, wow, John is just like, wow, shit, I made it. And he makes plans.
Nah, I think, I don't think you do that. I think you go back to your hometown and you be the guy that processes tax forms. I think that's, listen to your dad. He knows what's up. They got good benefits there. And, Sheila von Karstein or whatever's been asking about you. And, it's time to go back home. Fuck the monarchy,
Dude, and I think, like, something will happen now that I think made him exactly have these thoughts. Like, why didn't I just go home? I just fucked up my entire life because of this. Because what happens is he quits his job.
Okay.
He's like, okay, nice. I'm going to be the counselor of the prince. Fuck yeah. He quits his job with the general. He's just like, okay, I need like a week to check in with my university to do some formal arrangements, and then I'm going to be back and going to be teaching the prince, man. I'm going to be living the prince life. He goes to university. He comes back like a few days later to meet his new boss, Prince Wilhelm. But Wilhelm is gone.
Oh.
And he's like, whoa, what's going on? And what happened is Wilhelm fucked up because these noble people, they had to go like to dinners and stuff with other noble people. And he was the prince, and he wasn't even the son of the king. He was the prince of some other like duchy or principality or something. And during a dinner with the king of Prussia, Wilhelm commented on a marital argument the king was having and fell into disfavor.
Oh no.
And then he was sent to the front line of a war.
Oh.
Where he died of an infection really quickly. And he was, when John came back, Wilhelm was already dead.
Okay, so wait. Okay, so John goes from old Johnny boy, Johann von Johnstein. He, just to clarify, he rises through the ranks pretty fucking quickly, right? He is the tutor of a general, and then he meets all these fancy people, and then he's going to be a personal counselor to the prince, and then the prince makes a bad sex joke at a party, gets sent to the front line, and dies in the time that John is going to go back and tell his university that he's going to go work for the prince. Okay.
In the time that John basically cut off all connections to everybody else.
Well, should have listened to your dad, Johnny boy. You know, he told you.
He should have listened to his dad,
Stable job, man. You go palling around with the aristocracy. They're going to die of an infection on the front line. See, it's like I told you. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, that sucks. What now?
He was out of a job. He was 27 years old. Okay, this is maybe also a good time to talk about war and how it defined the world at the time. So, because like it seems like that this is like a random thing that didn't happen to many people, but this happened all the time. Because war was an absolutely permanently present thing. Like, it was absolutely normal for great nations at the time to engage in these great wars where most of the country's resources, may they be material or human, were spent on defeating an enemy. Like every 7 years or like every 10 years, there would be a war like that. So you would basically in your lifetime constantly experience war like this, and all people around you would die of war. You would always know someone that died in the war. And even though most of these German states kind of existed in this alliance called the Holy Roman Empire, this political unit was completely unable to maintain stability. Like these states, even though they were in a union, would go to war with each other. So going back to John, you kind of have to understand that events like this, when his patron Prince Wilhelm died, they were not an exception, but absolutely common. I don't say he could have foreseen it, but I think that is the reason why maybe he didn't give up immediately, because he was, not because he was used to it, but because this was something that just happened to people. Mm-hmm. The world just did not know what lasting peace was. It just didn't exist. The concept was completely strange to everybody. There was no way that there's something like that could ever be. If the world knows lasting peace today, that is like a completely different question entirely. But I just want to understand that John's entire life was embedded in war. Everything, even though he wasn't a soldier, everything around him was war. The boys that he was teaching for the general, they would go to military academy, and in a few years they would become officers themselves. All the people he talked to every day, all these officers, they were all talking about nothing else but going to war constantly. Like every day in their life, they were preparing to kill other people for their nation. And all the ultimately mathematical questions that he was ever asked were exclusively concerned with winning war. So that was his entire life. And I think you have to understand this. He was 27 years old. He was younger than we are now. I think at his age, he must have already been quite the expert in military theory. And this is where the story continues, because this is the important part. He was at this age, he was already an expert at teaching people about the theoretics of war in the military. Some of the sources that I use speculate that Helbig already had plans at this point, because He of course, he further ignored his dad. And he didn't settle down and become a government clerk. He tried to get employment in the Principality of Brunswick by corresponding with the local region called Karl I. My sources speculate that he tried for Brunswick because the Principality was known for being open towards the Enlightenment movement. The Enlightenment movement is like another term we have to elaborate on, but since this episode already is bringing with huge amounts of random historical terminology, I'm just going to explain it too. Who cares, right?
Go for it. You know what? It's a Dachz episode. It's what I expect.
So the Enlightenment was like a cultural movement of the era, and it was kind of the process of moving towards scientific progress. So in the simplest of terms, the goal of the Enlightenment was to enlighten people about the scientific nature of the world, and most of the scientific culture that we have today kind of goes back to the Enlightenment. So it's actually something that we kind of build upon today, even though maybe the scientific ideas that they had back then are completely strange to us today. And so the Principality of Brunswick, under Karl I, they were kind of open towards the Enlightenment, and John Helvig wanted to be part of that. He wanted to be part of this scientific progress. And he liked the idea of challenging traditions and improving society by teaching people about the nature of the world. And due to its acceptance of the principles of this Enlightenment, Brunswick transformed during this time. Like schools were opened up, museums were built, theaters were funded all of a sudden, and Brunswick turned into this cultural hub. And because John Helvig liked it so much there, he would remain there for the rest of his life.
Okay.
He would actually have his main residence in Brunswick. And he got hired as a teacher for, it's like a synonym for, like, he was a teacher for pages, but not the pages in the book, but like these young noble servants. The definition of a page is like, it's like a high, like if you are born into a highborn family and you're like between 7 and 14, you will go into this, like in the medieval times, you would kind of prepare to be a knight. But during this time already, you would basically prepare for the responsibilities in court. And you would basically serve as, you would be a servant, but you would basically assist older noble people.
Did you know
so
that in the United States Senate, pages still exist? There is a program to become a page, and I knew somebody who once got selected for it. Bit of a long story there. But the long and short of it is that they take like teenagers and you go do like a set amount of time working in the Senate, doing much of the work that you were kind of talking about, right? You're kind of like an intern, sort of like in today's terms. And, but you know, you see them, if you ever like watch closely, like if you ever watch a feed of the Senate floor, you can see them sort of sitting off to the side. If you see like a bunch of teenagers sitting off to the side, the Senate pages are like teenagers who essentially like run and grab things that are needed for the day-to-day business of the Senate and sort of help out. And in return, they get to have like a cool experience where they get to like sit on the floor, they get to meet all these people, and like not to go on a tangent of my own, but you can kind of get like, I always kind of thought of like a measure of how senators are. If you watch how they interact with the pages, you get kind of an idea of like what kind of person they are. And so like example, I've always really liked like Cory Booker. Like I've always heard Cory Booker is like a really nice guy. I know people who have met him, that kind of thing. And he is apparently super nice to the pages, and he like sneaks them candy and like talks to them and all this stuff. And like, I always thought that was really cool. But yes, pages still exist in the Senate, and I'm sure that they exist in other places, but I'm a political scientist. That's what I think of immediately.
Yeah, and the basic idea, probably also with the pages in Congress, but also with the pages during this time, was not to actually teach them the profession, but also like to teach them a lot about how to behave in the setting, and how to behave in court, and how to approach people of that rank, and how to be a nobleman, and by just watching other noblemen. Because he was hired as a teacher, John was hired as a teacher for pages. He basically taught these young men, these pages, taught them math, but he would also like be like a constant counselor for them. And these boys, because they were these were high-born kids, they would turn into noblemen in a few years. He was basically building up a connection to future influential people by teaching them. He was like setting himself up for a huge boost in vitamin B. Is vitamin B a thing you say in English?
Well, I mean, it's like
okay,
something you'd take in a pill form so that you...
Okay, I understand. Right? That's like an idiom in German. In German, we say vitamin B if it's like, if you get an advantage by being on good terms with someone.
Okay.
You can say like, he got that job because of his vitamin B.
Oh.
So that's like something you say. So he was like building.
So does the B like stand for anything, or is it just like a stand-in?
Yeah, for I think it stands for Beziehung, which means like relationship.
Okay.
So vitamin relationship.
Okay, that's interesting.
Which now explains why it doesn't exist in English, because it's a different word.
Well, also, English does, like, we tend to pick up, like, English speakers tend to pick up little phrases from other languages and then incorporate them into our speech and then say, that's English, so shut the fuck up. It's been here since forever. It's ours now, and you don't get it. So
it could have been English too, yeah.
Who knows? But so basically, old Johnny Boy here is setting himself up for round 2, right? He's teaching a bunch of kids again. He's teaching noble kids again, so to speak, and making connections again.
He's going to be teaching at that page school for the next 20 years. And like these are like 7 to 14-year-old boys, and a 7-year-old boy within 10 to 12 years turns into a 20-year-old boy. And then that all of a sudden, that is a person that has influence in court and can get him money and the resources to change things. So actually the next 20 years kind of turn into the best part of his life, because he has secured employment, he actually gets his PhD, he makes enough money to get his little brother to move in to the same town as him, and he kind of finances his medical school, he gets married, he has several children, and all of these influential young people know and respect him. They really like him because apparently he's a really good teacher. So Karl I, that guy that hired him, the regent, at some point he dies. And he was a supporter of the Enlightenment, but he was still reluctant in some parts because he was an old dude. That Karl I died, John can use this influence that he built with the new young elite to further reform the education system. And he becomes, actually in Brunswick, John becomes a man of decent influence. Like, he's someone that you know within the region.
Sorry, I'm just sitting here being like, how is he going to relate this to video games? And all I can think of is like, just have this bit in my head where like Dr. Von Johnstein walks into his students one day and he goes, I've created something. It's called a video game. And he's just got a bunch of pieces of paper and he's like, when you put your finger on this drawing of a button, this guy's gonna move, and he's just got him on like a little guy on a stick, and then he just goes bloop, bloop, bloop in front of a background. And oh no, here comes a scary guy. He's a mean guy. Better get him. Better press that button. And then he just kind of shuffles the papers around, and they're like, this guy, he is the best teacher. He is so fucking good at his job. The kids just love him.
John has like a John has like a time travel fever dream. And he experiences like 25 seconds of Super Mario Brothers. And then just teaches it to the students on paper.
I just keep hearing it in my dreams. I just hear it over.
Dun, 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 dun. Oh, I can't do it. It's copyrighted music.
Yeah, please don't. Nintendo, please don't. Please, we don't make any money from this. Please.
Because we don't have any.
No, we're poor. Please. But anyway, okay. So John's fever dream about video games.
You will have the twist. The twist will happen in the next few moments. Okay. So we could speak of Helwig's further life, but we will not. Because this is where the deciding part of his life happens that we are interested in. His time as a teacher in Brunswick will produce the reason for why Helwig is featured in this podcast. John Helwig, he liked alternative ways of teaching. alternative means he did not want kids to spend their entire days memorizing random facts or terms. John Helwig designed an educational game. And what game, you ask?
Super Mario Brothers made of paper.
Tyler just sent me a picture of Super Mario Bros. Made of paper. Yeah, that's what he made. No, we're going to actually listen to a quote of John from his rulebook.
Okay.
I'm going to give him a funny voice. In the invention of this game, of which I first made an attempt in the year 1780, I had the intention to visualize some rules of the art of war, and thereby be useful to the student of this art. A secondary intention was to provide pleasant entertainment through a game to those who do not need such instruction, a game in which nothing depends on chance but everything on the player's performance. Experience has taught me that I have not missed my intention. This encouraged me to give the game greater perfection. To what extent the attempt corresponds to the inventor's intention must be left to others for judgment, as I cannot be entirely impartial. Even if it were found that this stands at a lower level of perfection than I flatter myself, experience has taught me that it illustrates many rules of the art of war, and has been very helpful to beginners in this science in gaining insight into important truth of that doctrine. I did not make this pleasant experience alone. A scholar famous in that field, the ducal Brunswick Colonel Morillon, convinced himself of it by examining some of his listeners. This prompted him, who was initially skeptical of the game as a means to contribute to the education of a young warrior, to become acquainted with it. He became an eager defender of it. Only death prevented him from translating it into the French language to make known abroad an invention that seemed to him to be anything but unimportant.
Wow.
End of quote.
Mm-hmm. So he made the first.
Helwig
he made the first war game.
A
Yes.
war game.
Awesome.
And yeah, not just any war game. It is literally called Kriegsspiel, which means war game. And one might argue that it is actually the first game that actually tries to simulate warfare.
Well, this is what I was going to ask you, because I assume that there have been like war games throughout history of some kind, right?
Dude, and this is what everybody says, like, and this is what I thought, like, I have seen movies, right, where there's like medieval kings
and they're using the stick.
Tables with these
they have
figures.
the sticks that they move the figures with.
There's literally no evidence that
Are
existed.
you gonna fucking tear down my worldview? I want them to move the forces with sticks, Dachz.
I was convinced, but we have no evidence, archaeological or others whatsoever, that this happened. There is around Helwig's time, there's evidence for it, that other people did it. But before that, long time before that, we do not know, because this is not how people thought about war. This is how we think about war. We have this top-down cartographic view on war. But other, like Napoleon, for example, even though Napoleon was a few years later than this, or Caesar. Like, there's a good example of what Caesar did. When Caesar did a battle, he would go onto a hill and look upon the battlefield and then discuss with his generals. If they were discussing theoretical battles, they would basically do it in their mind or write down things, but they would not draw a map and then play out scenarios to come up with tactics. That did not happen. Never. Or at least we do not know of it. Helwig is the person that came up with it. And this really fascinates me, that this happened so late, because it seems like such an essential part of good warfare. Right?
No, it totally makes sense. I'm just kind of flabbergasted. You always would think that this existed, but I don't know, man. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Well, wait.
That it did not exist.
So I suppose it's possible, and you would know this more than I would, that these things existed in some way or another, but they were never written down into a rule book that we could point back to. Is that what you're or did just no one ever do this?
I would say that it's very unlikely that it existed, because what is the reason why something like that would exist? It's because the Enlightenment movement made such thought possible. Because the only reason to make such a game is to make teaching accessible. And the thought of making teaching accessible was for a very long time a very strange idea. And now, during the time of Enlightenment, where people like Helvig, that certainly existed before him, but never got into any influential positions, because there was no movement that would ever support them. Now that people like Helvig would get into this position, they could basically, even if someone before him would have come up with this idea, which there probably was even generals that used something in their mind that was similar to this, and we just don't have any evidence of it.
Sure.
But that it was used, like John used this as a teaching tool that we actually have the rulebook of, that was used on a broad scale for many people that would actually influence military strategies for centuries to come. And this is something that did not exist. And this is actually my proposition as the title for this episode. It's the founding fathers of wargaming. Because
I'm down.
Helvig is not the only one given that title. He's called the guy that invented the first wargame, but then there's always people like, oh, but there's like a better wargame that came later on. We'll talk about that too. But first we'll talk about John's game, because we can talk about what the other fathers of wargaming achieved, but I think his take on it is really interesting, because we actually have the rulebook. I actually read it, and it's really neat. I have a digitalized version of the book. And I think I just want to talk about it a bit, because I know that some of our listeners and you are tabletop wargamers. So I think you might have some interest in this, just from
I'm very interested.
So the rulebook spans 200 pages. And it's written like a legal text, consisting 323 paragraphs separated into 22 chapters. Like
Are you telling me that our dear Johnny boy is a rules lawyer?
Yeah, he absolutely is. He made a legal text about rules. Yeah.
Okay, that's pretty rad.
So I talk a bit about the introductory comments that he makes, and then about the first two chapters, because they kind of describe how the game looked like, and then I will give you a broad description of the other chapters. But to just give you a too long didn't read about this, Helvig basically just modded chess very extensively. Like, he took chess and just went nuts on it. And you're gonna see how in a few moments.
I suppose that is a really smart idea, because of how, like, how do I put this? Chess has been around for forever, and you would be more likely to find someone with a chessboard than you would with the other random pieces that you might need to make a wargame, right? It's like taking existing materials.
I had the same thought, because also chess was highly popular at the time. So
yeah,
you would have an easy time explaining it to people, because we're like, okay, first off, this is like a chessboard. And then everything else is just added onto it. So a lot of these paragraphs in the book are actually not rules, but he kind of just debates like important things in war, and especially important things in war games, which I find very interesting. And these comments that he makes, I find like they kind of show you how he's very good at explaining theoretical concepts. Like I think actually reading this rule book is actually good material to learn about military theory. Not that I know anything about it, but after I read it, I was like, oh, I understand a few things a bit better than I think I did before. But also that it, like, he kind of mixes rules and his personal philosophical ideas, kind of makes it difficult to actually extract the rules of the game.
So you're saying he needed an editor?
Yeah, he absolutely needed an editor.
In some war games these days, they'll put all of the fun lore and thoughts of that up front, and then they'll get into the rules so that you don't have to dig through the lore to find the rules. But you know, John can't be perfect in every way.
John should have put some of the lore in front of the book.
Yeah.
But I didn't think it was a bad thing, because I was like, yeah, I'm not going to read 300 pages of something just to give Tyler a good explanation. But then I kind of got into it and started enjoying reading it. Sadly, it's in German, so I can give it to you, but you won't be able to read it.
So it's at Kriegspiel? Is that how you say that?
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's several games that come up in the next 100 years that are all called Kriegsspiel. because they all basically iterate on Helvig's idea, because his game in certain elite circles got very famous.
Okay.
But in his rulebook, he basically starts with the simplest ideas, like how a good war game, like no matter, like if you want to make a game about war, it must recognize that there's different troops that have like different abilities, and that's like the basic that it is. If a war game doesn't do that, then it's not a good war game. And he says how there must be good rules to handle different terrain and also obstacles, because this is what's important and what also distinguishes it from games like chess, whereas ideas like that don't play any role at all. And he also thinks it's important that there's war machines that are very diverse, and but in the end, it's important in a game to reduce complex things to simpler things, which kind of blows my mind, because it's such an idea that is so far ahead of its time, like in game design theory, that I'm a bit impressed. But I read it, and he was like clearly, if you make a game, you gotta have like a very reduced, clear idea of what you're doing, so people can understand it. And that was really cool.
That is neat.
And somehow I think that his rulebook is kind of prophetic about how rulebooks are going to develop in the next 100 years.
So it was adversarial. Was there any sort of random chance associated with it, or was it just like, this piece represents this troop and it does this thing? Like what? Like give me the crunchy basics.
We're gonna get into the crunchy basics. I'm just gonna start. But it's a good question, because he says in his game he didn't add any kind of idea of chance, which was also due to the fact that probability theory and the entire science of stochastics wasn't developed as far that would make it possible to build like a good predictable system around it. So he probably just didn't have the skills to do it.
It's really interesting that you say that, because even today, Andrea and I were playing a game of Warhammer, right? And I was, to give you just a small idea, I was charging in with some big scary Chaos Space Marines into one of her Eldar units. Think of like very quick space elves is the best way I can put that. And she said, I don't know, should I use this ability? Should I spend a couple of my little tokens here to use this ability to fight you first? And I said, well, let's look at the probability of how much damage you're going to do to me if we take statistics. How many attacks are you going to get? Okay, what do you need to roll? Okay, statistically, you're only going to hit me 6 times, and then you're only going to wound me on average 2 times, and then I'm probably only going to take 1 wound. If we take the averages of all of that, is it worth 2 command points to do it to me? And she's like, well, when you put it that way, no. And I was like, well, see, like that's where statistics and math and all this stuff comes in, because now you can sort of game out the system. But if you don't have even a basic understanding of statistics, to be able to put that into a rule set, I can see how that wouldn't appear. How interesting.
Yeah. And building a balanced statistical system for a game is more difficult than many people might think.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And what I also found prophetic about is that he generalized resources. Like he said, okay, armies require food, and he wanted to include this in his game, like supply lines that had to be maintained. And he was like, but we don't have to go into what these resources that they require, like if you have food, if it's warm clothes. It's just like a general resource called needs, and if it's cut off, the army dies. And that's enough for him. And I think this goes into a lot of what war games would later do. Like even if you look at video games, 4X games that always use like simplified versions of resources to represent a larger idea.
Right.
Now let's do what you asked for. The most basic idea of what the game actually wants of you. So first, like in any rulebook, the first thing you have written down is how do you win? Okay, you win in this war game, however it may look. One player wins against another if they conquer their land. Just how in war it works. There's in his game there was a clear win condition, which you have to remember. This is important. He had a very clear win condition, and a land is conquered once it can be easily held, which he says means you conquer the land's fortress. If you conquer the fortress, there was like an entire section just about conquering fortresses. The war was won, and one side basically conquered the land. And if all the fortresses were conquered, that was the end of the game.
Okay, and were these like squares on a chessboard that were considered to be those things? Okay.
I will give you how this. Okay, but now we have the win condition: conquer the fortress of the land.
Okay.
How did this look? Okay, basically imagine a chessboard. Now he describes the playing board is it's kind of, the size is kind of arbitrary, but he liked to go for 4 feet times 2.6 feet. And onto this paper, you were supposed to draw 49 equidistant lines across the widths and 33 across the lengths. You were supposed to draw a chessboard. And it was at this point that I realized, oh shit, John didn't have graph paper. Poor fucker. He always
I guess not.
No, he always had to draw his own game boards. And just imagine he has to draw like 1,600 squares onto a piece of paper. Good thing that he had Pages working for him that could do that work for him.
Get in here, Pages. I have a very important task for you.
Oh no, it's Teacher John again, and he wants us to spend our entire day drawing graph paper.
Shut up, Carl. He's a good teacher, okay? Okay? He showed me that Italian guy. Jumping, okay? He's a good teacher. I'll draw his 1,600 squares, okay? I don't know what the fuck a Goomba is, but I'm really excited about it.
Yahoo! Okay, so basically the first thing you do in the game is you spend half a day drawing graph paper. Mm-hmm. And then you start coloring the squares.
Okay.
So different colors mean different things. White and black squares are just like on the chessboard, just normal terrain, where troops can move through and shoot through and stuff like that. Then there's the red squares, which is like obstacles that you can't move your troops through. But you can't even shoot through them, like mountains.
Okay.
And then there's like green squares, which are obstacles, like swamps, that you can't walk through, but you can shoot through them. And then there's blue squares, which are water, which is too deep to cross. And you can also represent buildings by drawing like half of a square red. And buildings can be occupied, and they give you cover against fire and artillery and stuff like that.
Oh man, I was just thinking about those like dry erase mats that I have for D&D, and like how much of a fucking game changer it would have been for him to not to just be like, let's roll out the mat and this one's green, but like, oh man, drawing them all by hand.
Just imagine it, you like dressed as you are now, you just open the door, walk into the room, and he's just sitting there drawing, being done with drawing like a quarter of the graph paper, and you just lay the thing down, you draw one line on it, then take some eraser, erase it again, and then look at him, give him a wink, and just leave. Drop the microphone.
He says something incomprehensible to me in German, but I know, I can feel the emotion.
Yes.
He looks at it and he says, "What is Chessex? What is Chessex? Is that the name of this magical man?"
Okay, so you have this chessboard, you color it, you can make all kinds of things that you also have in real life, and then you just use it like a chessboard, but certain things basically prevent your figures from getting caught by other figures. And this is basically the entire idea of the game. There's more details about how certain things work, and when there was different kinds of provinces on the map. Like you would split the entire plan into 22 provinces, and each player would get 11 each, and each player would get fortresses, and there's like an entire chapter about how to conquer these fortresses, and he had some pretty cool ideas. So
this sounds to me, if I guess I didn't put this together earlier. So it's not that he like took an existing chessboard and says you play it on the chessboard. It's more like he's recreating a grid that's larger than a chessboard to fit all of this stuff in and hand drawing it, but using the idea of, okay, so I'm seeing this picture that you sent me that's way bigger than a chessboard.
Yeah.
But he still uses the pieces from the chessboard to represent troops on the grid, right?
I have a picture of that too. No, he made his own pieces.
Oh, okay. Great.
Look at them.
Look at that shit! Oh man,
And he made
that's so
really
cool.
fancy pieces. Like,
Wow.
There was like 3 kinds of different troops, like infantry and cavalry and artillery, and he would fashion them out of lead and wood. And they basically they could move like a queen in chess, all of them. And they would all like one figure would represent like a cohort, like several of them.
Right.
But they could just move around on the chessboard.
To describe to all of you what this looks like and how I'm conceptualizing this, if you live in the United States or you've ever seen the game Sorry, okay, there are these little pieces that go with it, or I guess I'm sure there's something else, but it's just immediately what comes to mind, where they're very thick at the base, and then they slowly become thinner, and they have like a little pointed top, and on top of that little pointed top is sort of what I would call an approximation of a horse, like just the body and head of a horse, and then on top of that is just like the upper chest of a man with like a fancy hat on and a fancy mustache.
Yeah. It's
and
like
that
the
would be
bust
like
of a
one piece.
horse.
Yeah.
And on top of the bust of a horse is the bust of a man.
That's a better way to describe that. But yes. Yeah, all on top of like this little piece that, like I said, has like a wide base and a thin top.
And then you would have the huge board on which you would put these. That are basically sent you, which is basically a chessboard that is colored. It's much larger than a chessboard, like 4 or 5 chessboards. And what you would also draw on them, which you can see here, is like communication lines. So every army would have a communication line to the fortress, and you could basically disrupt them to starve them out. And then you could you could defeat troops by disrupting the communication, which would basically destroy the supply line and stuff like that. And we already talked about the troops, that they were made of wood and lead. And what he also did, what I found really cool, is that he did not only make this like figurines and like he paid craftsmen money to build them, but he also painted them using oil colors to make really pretty. And I'm like, okay, this dude just invented Warhammer.
he invented it. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Like if he would have started selling these figures for $15 a piece, we'd be calling War Helwig today, not Warhammer.
Kriegspiel 40,000.
And what you have, and then the game basically proceeded in turns like chess would. Though you could not, I think, if I understood correctly, you can not only move one figure by turn, but you can do a lot of moves per turn.
Okay.
And there was like a whole set of classes of different moves. Like a figure can not only like beat another figure, like put it up, like remove it from the board, but it can also like put buildings on fire, or destroy walls, or build a bridge, or destroy a bridge, or stuff like that. So there's like different actions that you can do. So it actually, people like I've heard people in texts talk down on it because it's so simplified, that I read the rules and I was like, this isn't simple. This is just you're just complaining that there isn't any dice to roll, but this is fucking complicated.
It seems it. Especially, like, imagine, I mean, it's like kind of hard, but like, imagine if you had never seen a war game before, and then someone was like, here is this entire game that simulates war, and like, having that experience of being able to do all of those things, like, this sounds like a lot to me. Like, I've played very simple games before, and this does not sound simple to me. I'm in agreement.
One thing that I imagine is when he was working for the general as a house teacher and he was having these dinner conversations with these guys. This is complete speculation, but I'm very sure that this general had a chessboard and they had these discussions about war. And that at some point where they were discussing troop movements, he just took a chessboard on the table and moved the figurines around and used chess figures to basically let them explain to him and him explain to them like mathematical or war movement problems. And I think this is how I speculate. He probably came up with this entire idea of thinking about war in this chess-like fashion.
Gotcha.
So yeah, I already told you that there's like different troops that they all move like queens, and then and then there was like rules how fast they can move. Like infantry can move 8 squares, and heavy cavalry can move 12 squares, and light cavalry can move 16 squares. And there's like a rule where like there was the figures would have a front, so you know where they would be facing. So you could only beat a figure from the flank, as far as I understand. Which is also a vastly different concept and makes like the chess thing very different. And infantry can shoot and stuff like that. Still, it's very chessy. He did not use randomness at all. And you basically win the game by you taking your troops and stepping onto other troops. This was the whole idea. Nothing else. Nothing fancy.
Follow-up question to that then. Do both players start with the same units in the same quantity, or is it imbalanced in any way? Like how did he determine who had what in their armies? Do you know?
He actually never goes, maybe I didn't see it. He never goes into balancing and how to make things balanced. He spends a lot of paragraphs on how important it is to clearly define rules, because people apparently started fighting in his early versions of the game a lot what was right and what wasn't. But he doesn't really go into how he would balance. I would guess, because he also spreads out the provinces equally to both sides, that he would probably give the equal amount of units to both people. But I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious. I mean, real life war is not exactly fair, right? But when you're playing a war game where you're sort of trying to match wits against somebody, generally balance is looked for. So I was just curious.
Yep. There was apparently it's a pretty swift game where troops get set off the board relatively fast.
Okay.
But it's still taught like the best way to win, according to Helwig, was to play very carefully and keep your front clear and take care of your flanks. And if you basically played careful enough, you could already, because this was mainly designed, but apparently also older officers enjoyed it, but mainly designed to teach pages the basics of war. And I think for this, it was more than sufficient. And according to his introduction, and by how popular it became within the elite of Brunswick and probably also in Prussia, it became clear that officers enjoyed playing this game to kind of think of ideas of war, which I think kind of speaks for it. It's a pretty intricate game. It's a huge rule book. And I would actually like to play it once, but I think it's too much work to get through his lore jabble to actually extract the actual rules. I hope maybe I bet some German guy already transcribed it in a way that it's easier to read.
I'm sure, I don't want to say sure, but I'm 99% sure that someone out there has created a Kriegspiel tabletop simulator thing that you could go do. And I'm going to Google it while I talk to you. So,
yeah, it might be that you find something that we'll be discussing in a few minutes that is from a later time.
Yeah.
But maybe. Because, the problem with Helwig's game, we are going to leave Helwig, John, behind now, is that there was no randomness.
The International Kriegspiel Society. Modules for Tabletop Simulator. There you go.
Nice. Sick.
Sick.
It might be that Kriegspiel is also a general term for any wargame that is kind of this old schooly.
Oh shit, that makes sense because did I just see that Kriegspiel translates to war game? Yeah. Okay. So, well, that was very exciting for a second. Now I have no idea, so we should just continue onward. I tried.
I will look at this later on.
Okay, cool.
But yeah, the lack of randomness is a problem if you want to make an actual war game, because chance is a huge factor in war. That even both of us that have no clue how actual war is understand this.
Right.
But his attempt to make a war game would actually inspire many others actually in the national vicinity to improve on his ideas. And there's one guy that would become especially famous, and the best war games would actually be named after him, that came a few years after him. His name was George Reiswitz. We will call him George. Mm-hmm. And George's dad, who was a Prussian baron, he had actually already designed a war game that was kind of inspired by Helvig's attempts, but that used dice. He was never really able to complete his game. And he designed this game during the Napoleonic Wars, which started in 1800.
Okay.
But even though his George's dad lost interest in his own war game, but George himself always enjoyed it, and he kind of kept designing and improving it. His game was also called Kriegsspiel, which is why I thought that if you would Google something, you would probably find confusing things.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But it was different in a few aspects that are very important to an improved Kriegsspiel. The first thing, and maybe let's start out by showing you a picture of it, because this will already explain it, what the difference is. This is Reiswitz war game.
It's not a grid. That's the first thing I see.
It's not a grid. It's a map, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this was basically, you could just take any map and play Reiswitz game on it.
Yeah, and the pieces here, to describe them to you all, look like little tiny rectangles of like maybe painted wood, and there are some dice off to the side that it looks like you roll. Yeah. And is that a measurement thing there?
There's a measurement too, yeah.
Okay, cool. So I guess once you would establish what the scale is of the map you would want to play on, then you would kind of have an idea of movement and things like that. How cool.
Yeah. Yeah. And you must understand one thing.
Mm-hmm.
Helvig designed his game as a hybrid between a professional war game and a recreational war game, where we're going to talk about this difference a lot because it's important, and we will figure out why it's important.
Okay.
Reiswitz, George, designed his war game as purely a professional war game. He wanted this to only to prepare people for war. And John had still kind of an emphasis on it. This must be fun. Reiswitz didn't. Reiswitz thought his game was fun, but it wasn't his main idea. He wanted to solve a few problems with war games. So first off, he used a real map. Second, there was not only two players, but there was an umpire. There was a third person. And this third person is important because this person oversaw the game. And the third, the moves that you would make your troops do, you wouldn't do them yourself, but they went through the umpire.
Okay.
Basically, the troops of both teams, I think they moved simultaneously, and each team basically gave a little paper with commands to the umpire, and then the umpire would interpret the commands, which you have to understand. This is a professional war game. This is supposed to teach officers to give clear and understandable commands that can be executed by someone else.
Right.
And this idea I find really cool, and I kind of miss that we have never, and you know more about current war games than I do, but I have not encountered this.
So
in
the only
current wargaming.
So two things that come to mind when I think of this. One, have you ever played a game called Diplomacy?
Yeah.
Okay, right. In Diplomacy, you write down what you're going to do, and then everybody does those things simultaneously each turn, right?
Yep.
Though there's not like a neutral arbiter. Given that I've played a shit ton of Warhammer, the original version of Warhammer was basically a quasi role-playing game called Rogue Trader. And, well, it was a role-playing game, really. But anyway, the idea is you had these little figurines, and you could fight each other with the figurines, but it required an outside umpire, like a DM, almost, like you're saying, to sort of narrate the battle and how things would go. Now, some of you may have actually played this. I have only heard of this secondhand. I've not played it myself. But you needed a third person in order to do that. So that was even in like the 80s that you were still playing games where you sort of needed, even this adversarial thing, you needed an outside person. So that existed. Yeah. I'm sure that something out there surely exists now. But
a close relative of mine played a lot of Diplomacy.
Yeah.
via email, actually, which was pretty cool.
Oh, that's fun. Oh, how cool. I see how you could do that. The last game I played of Diplomacy, just a fun aside, I was playing it and a buddy of mine brought me into the other room and was like, because, in Diplomacy, you all walk around, you have a certain amount of time that you can talk to each other about what you're going to do. And he's like, hey, like, listen, like, I know, like, we're technically like enemies right now, but like, let's team up. Like, let's team up. Let's go take out this other guy. And I was like, yeah, sure, dude. Sure. Absolutely. And then I stabbed him in the back. Right.
Classic.
And he's like, oh, come on. Right. Right. So then the next round he comes out and he goes, hey, I know you stabbed me in the back. I understand why you stabbed me in the back, but listen, we should team up. We should team up and we should take this other guy out. And I'm like, yeah, sure, dude. No problem. Yeah. Whatever you say. Sure. And I stabbed him in the back the next turn. 100%. I stabbed him in the back the next turn. So
fool me twice.
That was years ago. And I still feel bad about it. Like, I still can see the look on his face. So, hey, Mitch, if you're out there and you're listening to this, sorry, dude. This is my formal apology.
Okay.
Diplomacy's great, though.
Back to the game. In the Reiswitz game, there's a fourth big difference. And that is that there was dice. There was randomness. And if troops fought against each other, like in John's game, just the troop that beat the other one, the one that got beaten just got removed. In Reiswitz's game, in George's game, dice would determine the losses of each side. And this basically like elevated the war game so much that Reiswitz is actually also counted as one of the founding fathers of wargaming.
Nice.
And George, actually, he gathered this group of wargamers around him, like Prussian officers that liked to play with him. And one of the members of his gaming circle group, his nerdy group, was this, actually the Prince of Prussia.
And that guy's name? John Warhammer.
Johnington Warhammer son. No, I can actually give you a picture. It's also Wilhelm. Lots of them were called Wilhelm. That's an old picture of him.
Oh my God, look at that guy. I kind of want to hang out with that guy.
And he was a prince in Prussia. And he was the successor to the throne of the country. So super influential. Prussia was a big time player in the German Confederacy. Mm-hmm. This picture that you're seeing is like 30 years after George knew him. So he's like an old dude already. But when this guy was a young man, he knew George, and he was playing like war games with him.
To give you an idea of what this guy looks like, because this is an older picture of him, or rather he was older at that point in his life. So like starting to sort of bald in the middle of his head, but has some sort of fruffy hair around the outside. If I had to guess, he's maybe in his early 50s, just as a guess. Kind of has those sort of like frown lines that you get. And he's wearing this very sort of, I don't know, princely / militaristic style coat with like buttons up the front, and he's got this sort of sash, and the little cuffs on the outfit also have sort of like those, like these little metal inlaid things. It's a really stylish coat.
Yeah, I think it looks like it's all made of satin, so he was probably also very shiny. Yeah, he's like a shiny Pokemon.
He is, yes.
Yeah. So yeah, this guy, Wilhelm, he loved the game. He was really into it. And he invites George to meet his dad, the king.
Wow.
And George is super stoked about this. And George spends like a ton of money to refine his game, because he was like playing on funny little maps with funny little wooden tokens. But he was going to meet the fucking king. So he had like to up his game. Because his game was good, but if you have to impress the king, you have to make something good. So he spends a lot of money on a huge gaming table, and that is mega fancy. That had he had this
life goals,
ceramic tiles that were like painted with different landscapes, so you could switch out the map like on the fly.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Oh man. So wait. So I'm gonna say, was this like one of the I guess I don't know, but like this seems to me sort of like you're starting to see the evolution of, oh, okay, well, we're going to play a war game and it's on a grid. Well, now we're going to play a war game and it has these tiles you can switch it out and they're painted and they're nice. And you could start to like, in my mind, you're starting to see things evolve until eventually you get to look at these little plastic trees, right? Like till terrain becomes 3D. We're not there yet, but that's what I'm imagining.
This is something that absolutely comes up more and more. Like there's first a modularization, and then that there's like more plasticity to things.
Those are both really good words to describe that evolution. Yeah.
He also ordered like super fancy figurines for the soldiers because he was just using those little wooden paper things, but then he just wanted it to look really nice for the king. The king and his family loved it. They were really into it. And at this point, I want to repeat that Prussia was known, like, maybe I didn't say it yet, but Prussia was known for its military prowess. It was like the military powerhouse in the German Confederation. And the military superiority was the number one goal of the Prussian state. And being a great military man was the greatest achievement among the Prussian people. So a game to sharpen one's military prowess fit perfectly into the Prussian doctrine. It was the ideal way to waste your time by becoming a better soldier. But even though the king liked it, it still kind of remained a very niche hobby, and it took a long time until actually the military started using it. But a long time isn't that long, because he showed it to the king in the 1820s, and he, like 1820 things, I think. And in 1840, 35 years later, they started actually using it as a standardized way to teach Prussian officers. So by 1860, all Prussian officers were teaching, you call it until this day, the Reichswitzchen war game, because it was in the general idea would actually, until this day, not change anymore. Because he basically set all the basic ideas that to this day we need to make a war game.
How cool.
But it was still only the Prussians that were playing it, nobody else. George had died very early. He didn't see that this happened, which is kind of sad.
That is sad. When you say died very early, what's early in 1800s terms?
He died younger than we are. He died at 30 years of age.
Oh, that is like really early.
He was like 25 something when he showed it to the king, and 5 years later he was dead.
Well, hey, here's the repeating thing in this podcast. All the best ideas come out of 25-year-olds.
It's true. Yeah. And like
but that is a shame.
A friend of him later on wrote about him that he got kind of influential in the court. And some people, like some of his friends later on said, like he was banished into like a lower position because some people got jealous and kind of spread rumors about him.
I was expecting you to say that he made a crack about the king's sex life and got sent to the front, but you know.
No, that was the other Wilhelm. Oh.
It is the fate of all Wilhelms.
So yeah, but now something like George is dead, but something important happens. In 1816, they start using the Reichswitzchen war game to teach Prussian officers. Then 10 years later, in 1817, a big war happens. It is the so-called Franco-Prussian War, which, if you want to oversimplify the reasons for it, it was a Prussian nobleman had a claim to the Spanish throne. But the French emperor did not like this. And thus the French declared war against the Prussians. And the war ended within less than a year with the humiliating defeat of the French. They got completely crushed by the Prussians. And for like the astounding victory of the Prussians made everybody think, like, why did the Prussians win so clearly? Like, what happened here? Because the French were a military powerhouse as well. Nobody expected this. And one of the conclusions people somehow came to was drawn that the Prussians were good at war because they constantly played these weird war games.
How interesting.
And this is the moment when war games started spreading around the world, because we're like, oh, the Prussians did something right, and they constantly, like, when you visit them, they just sit around and play these war games with these maps. And it's not that the Reichswitzchen game itself spread, but it's that at this point, everybody was like, okay, they won the championship. We got to figure out how they did it. And so every kingdom started developing their own kind of Reichswitzchen wargame. And all of a sudden, the European kingdoms had this culture of wargaming. And a good functioning military, basically a sigil of quality, was having a wargame that was enforced upon the officer class.
How interesting.
And you have to imagine these officers, these military people, all of them also have a private life. And of course, all of them would also bring these professional games into their home. And so this success of professional wargaming basically accelerated the success of recreational wargaming, which is an entirely different thing, which we will get into now. Because one thing you have to understand about the Reichswitzchen wargame, remember in John's wargame, there was a clear win condition. Like, you win if you conquer the fortress in the land. In George's wargame, this didn't exist. George's wargame did not have a clearly defined win condition, because George was of the opinion that was too complicated to make up win conditions. You just have to, the players have to kind of agree, like every player has to have their own objective, and the game ends when they agree to end it, because it's basically just to play through scenarios of war.
Interesting.
And to see if you can come out on top, which actually, from a recreational standpoint, is boring. It's not how you design a game to make it enjoyable.
Though I would say that, so even just thinking about, right, so I was just saying I just taught my wife her first game of Warhammer today. And even though the forces might be balanced in a way, like, you know, modern war games might use points or things like that. Or like I used to play a game called Malifaux, and it uses like stones, like soul stones, which is really just another word for points. Even though you might say, we're going to play a 1,000-point game and you both show up with 1,000 points of units, and maybe you say our main objective is to control these things in the middle of the board, you might have your own secondary objectives that you're trying to accomplish, which is kill their commander, or I need to complete this ritual, or I need to do this thing. And some of my most, some of the memories I have, the best memories I have of playing wargaming is when there was this weird asymmetry. Like, we did things that didn't necessarily fit the sort of pitched battle mold, and those were really fun, even if they were completely unbalanced. And so, I don't know, I think there's some fun there, right? Like, I think there's fun to do like a narrative thing absolutely. Of like, you know, my space aliens are trying to take these chaos worshippers off their ritual site and, like, you know, forming a narrative from that. Like, I think that's almost like its own form of role playing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Absolutely. To give you an example of recreational war games, the author H.G. Wells once, just before this First World War, met with a friend, and his friend started, like, they had these tin soldiers, and his friend started to use like a toy cannon to shoot at the tin soldiers, and they made a game out of it. And H.G. Wells basically published a book called Little Wars that basically designed rules around this whole concept of moving like tin soldiers around little model villages to fight each other, and you could actually shoot little cannons at the soldiers to figure out if you defeat them.
If I know that there's like little cannons that you can put like powder in, and they'll like actually shoot like a little cannonball. Yeah. Is that what we're talking about, or was it like a
I have like a picture of H.G. Wells' Little Wars, and in the picture the cannons use like little. Little corks. Describe what you see.
Oh my god, like my dream life? Okay. So, like, here's a bunch of fancy dudes all hanging out in full suits. Look at this guy in the background. He's got this huge fruffy mustache, and they're like sitting around in a house, and it's literally like the floor is a war game, okay? Like, they just stepped into a fucking room of their house, and that room is just the war game room. And so there's like a little village next to the river with a bridge across it. And there's like all these fruffy men in their full suits looking so excited to like move all these little figurines around. And it looks like this guy in the front is pulling some kind of a string out of the back of a cannon. Like, it's like he's going to pull it and it's going to fire. This is so cool.
Yeah, and you can even see the little cork in
Yes.
front of the cannon. Like, I think it's a cannon that shoots.
Yes. Oh, how cool. And see, like, this is like the 3D terrain, right?
Yeah.
Oh, this is so neat.
This would be a perfect Warhammer Fantasy battle.
It really
map, right?
would. Yeah. Oh, man, so cool. I'm totally into it. I'm going to send a picture of this to my wife and say, I would really like to have this in our house someday. And we'll see what she says.
So yeah, H.G. Wells wrote like a rule book about how you could rulify these kinds of role-playing, wargamey things for recreational use at home. But what we have now is, I think, a pretty good timeline of the establishment of the wargame as a recreational game, right? So because we start out with this idea of teaching military basics to pages, and within around 100 years, we go to having a recreational concept of a wargame that is simply played for fun and not for teaching war theory. Basically, all of this happened due to it being credited to achieving a major victory in a military conflict, which I find fascinating.
Well, I think what is fascinating about that is this really tracks with kind of the theme of this, right? Like, once this became... Okay, so when you say, oh, we're all going to sit around and play with our little figurines, right? People go, look at that. Look at them playing their little recreational game. Ha, ha, ha. And then suddenly when you start winning wars, because the things that you taught, the things that you created that taught people actual skills, suddenly you have to start taking these things seriously, right? It's not just, oh, look at your little figurines anymore. It's now a teaching aid that wins wars. And so you are forced to have to look at it with some kind of seriousness.
It's
How
funny
neat.
that you say it, because George Reiswitz himself actually didn't want to call it a game, but he didn't have a better name for it, because he knew that the name game always would be ridiculed. But he just didn't know how else to call it. So he stuck with game. But what is important now is that from this point on, where there is all of a sudden there's actually recreational wargames that are just published as recreational wargames, we have to maintain this clear distinction that there is something that is a professional wargame and a recreational wargame. And there is distinctions that you can make between them. First off, one thing that I already mentioned, recreational wargames very often have a far clearer winning condition. And also recreational wargames often recreate wars from the past, while the professional wargame always, of course, has to stay within the current technological vicinity, because you basically have to prepare for battles to come. You can't use old technology in the simulation to prepare for someone for future battles.
How interesting. Yeah. How I'm just like so fascinated by this, thinking about like how you could use this as a tool for whatever purpose it is that you're trying to accomplish, right? Like it could be like I'm thinking of how a friend and I, his favorite thing to do that we would do in grad school is he'd say, hey, you ready to play Axis and Allies? Let's do an Axis and Allies night. And he would get like a really good bottle of wine, and we would get like a bunch of snacks, and we would lay out the entire world, for Axis and Allies, which is a World War II game, by the way. Yep. For those who haven't played it. And we would just play war games and drink wine and laugh about how we were acting like the aristocracy of old, right? And It was kind of like our fun thing we would do. But then, you counter that with, well, what if you were actually trying to teach someone the skills they needed to conduct war? Like, how would you do that? And so I can understand the distinction that you're making.
Yeah, I have two good examples of further professional war games, though I don't have any current ones that are played because they're probably classified. But one is the Germans played a war game specific to submarine warfare.
Oh.
Just before the Second World War, which gave them a huge head start in front of the other superpowers that had submarines. And for the first few years, basically made them win all submarine battles.
Wow. Because
they had possibility to develop tactics ahead of time. A different example that is probably closer to the US Americans is there was a game called Tagspiel. that was used to train the US military and counter guerrilla operations during the Vietnam War. Because if you look at the wargaming of the Reichswitzchen, it cannot be applied as easily to the warfare that took place in Vietnam. And if just a heads up, if you do not know a lot about the Vietnam War, because I think not everybody does,
Sure.
There's one thing you need to know to understand what was special about Vietnam. And like during the Vietnam War, there was the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong, and they fought against the Americans and the Southern Vietnamese Army. And especially the Viet Cong, they were infamous for using these so-called guerrilla tactics, which means that they avoided any head-on confrontation due to technological disadvantage or lack in numbers. Basically, guerrilla tactic means that you do anything to defeat your enemy without ever confronting the enemy on the battlefield, because you would certainly lose on the open battlefield. So you'd lay traps, you'd ambush, you'd use civilians as cover, and you basically win a war using guerrilla warfare by being undefeatable due to being not present, while simultaneously slowly wearing down, killing, and demoralizing your enemy. Mm-hmm. And these war games designed by John and George, they were not capable of simulating something like that. There was nothing for it. So there had to be new games that were capable of basically simulating this kind of war environment to teach the officers, because it was necessary to teach the officers to be able to kind of handle the problems that an officer would face in the Vietnamese jungle. So I can describe you Tagspiel a little bit. Tagspiel sure. Also used an umpire, like the Reichswitzchen game. But the fighting factions would actually be played by several people, and they would sit in different rooms, and each of them would have different roles. Everybody would have be a different officer and have different responsibilities that would basically then write down the orders and give them to the umpire. And there also wasn't a win condition, because, as I repeated, this is a professional war game. It's not about win conditions. It's about elevating your position. And basically the game concluded in slight shifts of advantage that you would afterwards analyze to basically analyze what you did. Because it was supposed to simulate the actual situation an American officer would be facing within the Vietnamese jungle. I think it's kind of a good example of how you have to adapt war games to current theaters of war, or otherwise they're useless.
Yeah. Or at least they're useless to that situation at hand. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Thinking about the multiple roles and stuff. So since we last recorded, I went, a bunch of my friends, basically I went with them to Gen Con in Indianapolis, and it's like one of the biggest board gaming conventions in the world. I think what's the one in Germany that's like really big? I suddenly can't remember. Do you remember?
I can't remember right now either.
Okay, it's like the US version of that. Okay.
Yeah.
And one of the things that they talked me into, I think it was called a mega game, they called it. I might have some other name I'm missing, but essentially imagine like 50 people all go into a room and they all have roles, and you're on a team, and they go, okay, this is your team, and who is going to be the master of coin, and who is going to be the whatever. And then everybody had like delineated roles. And so at one point in time, they said, well, someone has to go serve on the council and vote on legislation. And everybody in my friend group just pointed to me and said, go, right? Because I'm like a political scientist, right? It's like, I eat this shit, right? So I would go in and I would meet with the council, and we would start passing legislation, and we would say, I'm going to bring this thing against the nation of whatever for their crimes against whatever. And all these other things are going on in the other rooms, where there's people with a map. There's people who are like managing the money. There's like the guy who's the leader, and everybody would go tell him, and he would make decisions. And so we all had our roles, and it was really fascinating. I'd never played something like this before. It seriously needed some balance, but that's a story for another day. It was a fun role-playing experience to sort of be in that situation in which you had a role and there were all these things that were outside of your control, right? And they'd be like, bad news from the front line. Oh man, we got pincer attacked by our allies and we just lost all our forces. You need to go in there.
That sounds really cool.
It was really neat. Yeah. So like I'd be like, oh, of course. Now I got to go deal with the fucking political fallout of this. Great, thank you. Let me go smooth this shit over. And so it was really fun. Yeah, would recommend.
And I think that's probably kind of also the idea of tech spiel.
Yeah,
that you you learn how to behave within a singular responsibility instead of having to overthink everything.
Right. Yeah. It was just you became good at your one role, and then everyone else's roles affected what you were doing, and vice versa. But how
I have an example of another recreational war game of the time that basically kind of is a contrast to Dachz, which was developed by Charles Swan Roberts. It was called Tactics. It was published by Avalon Hill in 1954. And the thing is that until Tactics was published, wargames were popular. Mm-hmm. People played them, but they were never produced for the mass market. Like, lots of people were playing wargames, but they all kind of had a lot of house rules or were not fully integrated. Like, you could buy The Little Wars by H.G. Wells, but you'd have to come up with the map and the soldiers and all that stuff. You didn't buy a full set of things that let you just play the game. And Tactics had all of that integrated. I think I have a picture of Tactics for you.
Okay,
I
cool.
have so many pictures, man, today, just for you. You can describe it.
I love it.
Yeah.
Okay, wow, look at this box. Okay. The box is black and white, and it has red letters, and it says, "The new realistic land army war game." And there are two guys in the background, and it's kind of hard to see, but I think one of them is smoking a cigarette, because, no, I can't tell. Maybe that's something on the map in the back. But regardless, two people in, like, officer uniforms are, like, looking at this map, and one of them is pointing, because, you have to point when you're looking at a war game. The map itself is sort of a grid. I'm trying to think of a good way. If any of you ever played Advance Wars or Wargroove or any of those kind of games that have sort of like a tiny grid.
Wargroove is nice, yeah.
Yeah, Wargroove is good. Yeah. Haven't played the second one, though. Slight aside, I was really annoyed that you can't get
also just Wargroove is a good example for how it looks.
Yeah. I was really annoyed that you can't get the true ending for Wargroove unless you go back and farm 100 stars. What a fucking stupid decision. So mad. I had like 78 stars and I was like, I'm not fucking doing this. I'm going to YouTube. I'm done. Anyway, so it kind of looks like that. Little pieces and little sort of like little squares, like little chits that have stuff written on them, it looks like, and then you can sort of move them around on the board and fight each other. Looks like a red versus blue kind of thing. Pretty neat.
Yeah, the team were actually called Red versus Blue.
Oh, well, I see. And they based that on the popular YouTube series.
Yeah, on that Halo show.
Yeah, on the Halo show. I think what was that, like 1947 that debuted, something like that?
Yeah, that debuted just before Second World War. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, you would know. You're okay. That makes sense.
Yeah. Anyway, Tactics... it came from an interesting point of view because Charles Swan, the designer, he was actually in the National Guard during the Korean War. And even though, according to his autobiography, he kind of always wanted to see combat, he never did. So he kind of practiced war by himself, designing a game. And he writes that its commercial success was kind of an accident. He didn't really want it to be successful. And it had nothing to do with his skill at game design. He was especially surprised that because his game was the first commercially successful mass-produced wargame. And years later, he was surprised that all of a sudden, the wargame genre was huge. And he is actually also credited as being the father of wargaming, even though wargames had existed for a long time, but he had made a milestone by making it mass market producible.
Right.
And profitable. He later also made a war game about Gettysburg, which is a good example of that recreational war games often recreate battles from the past. If you don't know what Gettysburg was the turning point battle in the American Civil War.
Right. I have visited Gettysburg, actually.
Cool. Is it nice?
It's pretty cool. Yeah, it's pretty neat. It's a very pretty place for all the horror that happened there. But yeah. So was the game called Gettysburg or was it called something else? Do you know?
It was called Gettysburg. Yeah.
Okay.
Also published by Avalon Hill. Yeah.
I was going to say they're not nearly as popular or accessible as something like Warhammer or any of the Games Workshop type things. But there are historical war games out there, and I do know of some people who play them. And I'm in a big wargaming group, like a locals thing, and they have like a historical section. They meet up and, reenact historical battles. I would also say that there's a lot of World War II war games. What is the one? Is it called Bolt Action? I cannot remember, but I know that there's some World War II ones that are sort of like historical things like that.
I bet.
Yeah.
I heard something about a World War II dogfighting war game. Like dogfighting, not the dogs, but like airplane fights.
Yeah, you're not making like dogs, like cute little pets fight each other. I mean, that's just Pokemon, so...
It's Axis dogs versus Allied dogs.
Ah, I see. Well, that tracks, because, you slap World War II on any kind of war game and people just eat that shit up.
And just sell it, yeah.
Yeah.
Just give anything a Hitler beard. Yeah, it's a franchise.
Oh my gosh.
There's
so many jokes I want to make, and I'm not going to make them. I'm not going to do it.
Just don't make them.
Nope.
Just don't do it.
Nope.
Okay, now we do have we have a solid basis for wargaming history. But since we are still, you won't believe it, but this is a video game history.
I was going to say, we're like 2 hours into this recording. I still have not heard of a video game.
I told you in the beginning that this will take a while.
No, you know what's really great about this is I have always said to Dachz that, like someday I will do a Warhammer episode, just because, I mean, it's just like, it's everywhere now. Somehow I woke up one day and it became mainstream. That's really strange to me. And there's like so many Warhammer like video games out there now. And I was like, someday I'll do a Warhammer episode. And one of the things I always struggled with was like, well, how deep do I get into the history of wargaming? Right? Here we are.
And I did the deep dive for you.
You've done the deep dive.
You can do I will actually not touch Warhammer, so now you can do it.
Cool.
And I did the groundworks.
Another day, another time.
But we will touch with video games, or we will try to touch video games now.
Okay.
Because the last missing link is actually will actually be produced by a friend of mine, because like I was asked to do an episode on a sci-fi robot war game called Metal Fatigue, like more than a year ago. And whoever, like, you know who I'm talking about. Whoever, if you're listening, Robin, I'm sorry. There's nothing about Metal Fatigue. Like, there is a little bit of stuff of Metal Fatigue. I know who made it. I know what it's about. But it wasn't done during an interesting time of a company. So I'm not. This is the Metal Fatigue episode. But I went completely batshit crazy. So we will actually find the missing link by actually closing the gap between the 60s with Tagspiel up until Metal Fatigue that was published in 2000. So we're going to cover 40 years of history and how we turned this into a real-time war game, a real-time simulation.
You know what's really interesting?
Yeah.
So to open the curtain a little bit about how we produce episodes, that is actually pretty common. That we'll start with something and then it ends up in a different place. To give you an example, you guys know I did that series on 90s consoles, right? Like the transition between 2D to 3D. I'm sure you are sick of hearing me talk about it. But that started out because I just randomly wanted to do an episode on Ape Escape. If you've never seen Ape Escape, it's a game where you run around and you catch monkeys in a net. It's a whole thing. Loved that game as a kid. Me too. Really cool. I was trying to do it. I couldn't find enough information to make a good episode out of it. Surely it's out there, but I started to abandon it because I got really into the controllers of that time and how the controllers were made and how the DualShock controller of the PlayStation became a thing. And then that just made me start looking at the PlayStation. And then I went, well, I can't just talk about the PlayStation without talking about and then suddenly I'm doing a 5-episode series on 90s consoles. It was originally just supposed to be Ape Escape.
That was odd.
Right? So like that chain of events is how I ended up there. So it totally makes sense. Sorry to your friend,
I'm still surprised that you pulled through. I'm really impressed.
I did it. I fucking did it.
Yeah. Okay. So let's start with our next founding father of wargaming.
Okay.
And he's going to be the first one that is going to do a digital wargame. And his name is Peter Langston.
I was hoping it was Peter Molyneux.
Fucking Peter Molyneux.
Beans, lots of beans, lots of beans, lots of beans. Anyway.
Langston was one of those early game design free minds that we encounter so often. He's just one of those guys that would code a game on a college computer for anyone to access if they like. And he designed a game that you maybe know, I don't know. It's a game that you sometimes encounter as one of those old precursor games. It's called Empire.
Okay.
And he programmed the game Empire on an HP 2000 mini computer owned by the Evergreen State College, wherever that is, I don't know.
Somewhere, presumably.
And Empire was the very first 4X game. And 4X is a very popular video game genre that I think is fair to be described as a subgenre of the wargame.
I would agree.
Even though 4X games differ from wargames by being infinitely more complex, since they are not only about war, but about all the logistics and governance surrounding a warfaring nation as well. And I know that you do play 4X games, like Stellaris, but do you know what 4X stands for?
Oh, let me think. Explore, expand, exterminate, exploit? Is that it?
Yeah.
Did I get it?
Wrong order, but almost, yes. It's explore, expand, exploit, exterminate.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
I can't believe I pulled that off.
Nice.
Okay. I was thinking about a jump that we could talk about at some point. I don't know if you'll do this, is even from that, the transition to real time, right?
We do that, yeah.
Okay. But anyway, continue.
That's an interesting jump, definitely. But we'll do the jump. Yep. But it started with 4X games. And the interesting thing about Empire is that it's actually more an idea than a clearly defined game. And that makes no sense, right? Because how is that possible with the game? There must be source code, right, that we can look at. But I think maybe you already get it just because we encountered stuff like this before of that time. And the thing is that this was the 70s and things were a bit complicated.
Wow.
So we haven't talked about video game design during that time for a while, so I will kind of reiterate for people that haven't listened to that. But the people that designed video games in the 70s very often did not do so to achieve like commercial success or anything, but they just wanted to engage in the communal art of video game creation. Which is something that we saw several times. Like, if someone like Peter Langston came up with a game and someone else would play it, nothing would stop them from changing the game or creating their own version of it. And even though we know of Langston that he did not like these changes, people made to his game, the general opinion of the people that made games at the time was that it was good to have this kind of culture of sharing source code as a communal property.
I'm thinking of the episode that I did on adventure. If you want a good deep dive into what it was like back then, that comes to mind. Like Will Crowther and the whole idea of like spreading that game and things like that, and how that just sort of expanded.
Also, how in episode 8 in the PDP-1 episode in Space War.
Yeah. Oh yeah,
They kind of program a game on that one computer and then it just spreads via disk to different universities. Or didn't it also happen with Tetris? It just turned into something that kind of crippled academia in Russia.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the original source code for Langston's the original source code for Langston's Empire disappeared because the computer it was stored on was retired. So nobody had it. But the copies persisted. So the things that other people did to it. And so many people played and liked his game that they simply remade it several times. So there's like different versions of Empire from different authors, and the original is unattainable. So we don't know what it was like. We just can't tell. So the only thing we have is like this echo of the real thing, which I think is kind of cool. Langston did remake his own game later on, but at some point stopped developing it and just gave his source code to other people. Now, one thing you know about 4X games, right, is that they often last long. And dude, Empire, to get into what Empire actually was, Empire took forever to play. It kind of worked like this. So you had a map, and it consisted of tiles that had different attributes. Like some tiles would be agricultural or industrial or other things. And if you gain control of a tile, you basically would be provided with the resources it could provide. And then you could use these resources to acquire more units, to conquer more tiles, basic 4X game loop.
Right.
And your turn would work like this. You would give your commands to the central server, and once a designated time passed, the server would execute all commands of all players. But it wasn't really clearly defined when these refresh times happened. So if you set your server to refresh once a day or once an hour, kind of depended on how fast you wanted to play. So sometimes people would just refresh once a week or once a day. And that could make an Empire game last a year or several years, because the turns would take so long.
That's so cool, because if it's all happening simultaneously, wow, that's really interesting. What an interesting way to do that. That's essentially offloading this umpire that you would normally need, right?
To a computer, yes.
Right. How cool.
Which was actually my first thought when I read about the Reiswitzchen game. Mm-hmm. That why are they the umpire is basically due to their lack of a computer. Mm-hmm. The umpire is a processor of commands. And so I think that actually Reiswitz basically had the mental capacity to be a video game designer. He just didn't have the tools.
Right. Well, though I suppose as a teaching tool, trying to get a human to understand your orders and then execute them is probably a better teaching tool for actual military strategy.
Professional wargaming, especially.
Right. But to
make your commands understandable. Yeah.
Right. So, but again, different ideas of, what you're trying to accomplish.
So Empire was very popular, and within 20 years and up until the 90s, there was dozens of different versions, all named Empire or named after the machine they were designed for. There was XDE Empire for Xerox machines, there was Amiga Empire, there was PC Empire for DOS, and there was very different versions of Empire that all kind of differed, but they all originated from Langston's Empire. And Empire was not the only 4X game at the time. Avalon Hill, the ones that did the tactics board game, also published Charles Swan's war games. They basically took all of their board games and turned them into video games.
Okay.
And that didn't work out financially.
Oh.
Because simply turning board games into video games is apparently not a way to succeed in in the video game market. Though at this point I must say that for example, Paradox Entertainment, the ones that made Stellaris, they started out as a board game company.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so I didn't know that.
That's actually something that they came from.
So what kind of board games did they make? Do you know?
I do not know.
Okay.
I started preparing a Paradox Entertainment episode a while ago, but then never finished. And I just have in my mind still that is their origin, and they just pivoted into video games and had more success with it.
I would love to hear it someday. But
the funny thing is that now they are doing board games again with the board game version of Stellaris, right? Which is
I kickstarted it. Oh my gosh. It's been in development for quite some time. I did see a prototype at Gen Con, and I was like, oh my fucking God, this is the coolest thing. But no one is ever going to play it with me. Come visit me in the US.
I will have a brief mention of the current state of the professional wargame.
Okay.
But it will take until 1989 until we get a real-time simulated wargame. And it's called Herzog 2. And I have a picture for you.
Oh, wow. Wait, was this called something different in the United States?
I do not know.
Oh,
I tried to figure out.
I am almost certain I have played this. Let me look this up real quick. Herzog.
This was developed in Japan by Technosoft for the Sega Mega Drive.
Yes, I'm so convinced I've played this. But continue on while I look at this.
And you must understand that this game is the inspiration for all real-time simulation games. If you look at this, you will basically see every real-time sim that you've ever played. Mm-hmm. This came before Command & Conquer. This came before StarCraft. But it does very much look like these games.
It really does. How cool. I can't find that it has a different name, but continue on.
In the game, you basically had to, like in any real-time simulation game, you have a big map, you can scroll over it, then you can build a base, and you build units that you can move around, and you basically just try to conquer the enemy base. And the funny thing in that game was, which kind of made it like a MOBA game too, is that your cursor was a little fighter jet that could also fight enemy units.
Oh, fun.
And what I really like about it, if you look at the second picture that I sent you, and you others just have to imagine it, it has those really cool 80s and 90s pixel graphics,
right,
that are like well refined, and I really enjoy them.
I guess I didn't describe this like I usually do. The cover, it says Sega Genesis, Herzog Zwei, 16-bit cartridge for use with the Sega Genesis video game entertainment system, blah, blah, blah. But the cover is like a fighter jet, and you are behind the fighter jet, and there are like these jets flying in, fighting these giant mechs, and there's like tanks on the ground. It kind of looks like if you told me this was a BattleTech game, I'd probably believe you. But yeah, like fighter jets and bases and this mech in a very, as you said, like 80s, 90s sort of style. And then what it actually looks like is, like, if you've ever seen StarCraft, like Dachz was saying, it's like a top-down overview of a battlefield with, like he said, pixel graphics. Very cool.
Like StarCraft, but a good bit simpler, but it also came 10 years earlier.
Sure, and on a home console, not a PC.
So Herzog 2 was a commercial success, but it wasn't the huge hit. What truly made the RTS game popular then was Dune 2, the second part of the Dune RTS game. And this was published in 1991, and later on in 1993 again for the DOS and the Amiga and the Mega Drive by Westwood Studios. Do you know what else Westwood published?
I do not, off the top of my head.
Westwood is the studio that made the Command & Conquer games.
Really?
And if you look at Dune 2, it just looks like Command & Conquer 1, like the first one. And it's basically very clearly the inspiration for what would then become, for a long time, the most successful real-time simulation franchise. Command & Conquer is dead now, but it was super successful from the 90s to the early 2000s.
How interesting. Yeah, I can see the different flavors of what eventually became StarCraft here, because I guess that would have been, what, like 8 or 9 years later then?
Command & Conquer came out in 1995 and StarCraft then 3 years later in 1998.
Okay.
And I remember, like, did you ever play Command & Conquer or StarCraft?
I played a little bit of Command & Conquer, but StarCraft, oh my gosh, StarCraft gripped me so strongly. Yeah. It absorbed, like, God, how old would I have been? Probably from 14 to 16. I just played so much StarCraft. It was when I sort of like hit my Blizzard phase. Like I had never heard of Blizzard Entertainment, except like a neighbor had like Warcraft 2 and would show it to me. And I was like, what the hell is this? But StarCraft, oh my God, StarCraft. It just gripped me.
StarCraft was so well refined.
It really was.
I think it's the peak of wargaming. And maybe I'm biased because I played so much StarCraft as well. But I think StarCraft, it has everything that RTS games need. There's nothing else you can add. Yeah. Add everything that is added upon is just like flavor.
I would agree. I feel like because of the competitive scene that like StarCraft is really interesting, and we could talk about it sometime, just as its own episode. But like StarCraft, like really kicked off like a competitive gaming scene that like I think kind of didn't exist.
StarCraft in Korea is as big as soccer is in Europe.
Yeah, it's nuts. And so like StarCraft 2, how do you follow that up? And I have some qualms about StarCraft 2's story, but that's completely vestigial to the core experience of 3 balanced factions that you can play competitively, and it's still played competitively. And like I have like a real beef with Blizzard right now. So, but like there are times when I think about like maybe I'll just install StarCraft and do nothing for like 4 days, like just nothing for like 4 days. I love StarCraft, man. Oh my God.
But just to reiterate, Dune 2 was basically the popular basis for real-time simulations. And Herzog 2 established the technology. the concept in video games. And then it peaked in StarCraft. And now we have so many real-time simulation games. Though, now that I think of it, kind of has dwindled down, right? There isn't many RTS games anymore.
Yeah.
Market is kind of oversaturated with them. And then they never touched it again.
I guess like it depends on what you call a real-time strategy. I would say that I have played several games in the last few years that had real-time strategy elements, but that like what did I play last year? Something called Crying Suns, I think it was like an indie game I played that was sort of like a mixture between FTLs, like story concepts of like you go to the thing, you do a check, you do whatever, but then the battles, kind of like FTL, were like these like top-down real-time strategy games between ships. So like that exists, and obviously there's still 4X games out there like that.
Maybe it's better to say that the industry kind of evolved out of it.
That's a better way to put that.
Kind of diversified the idea into more faceted games that are not just an RTS game.
I could see that. And I mean, perhaps maybe there are tons of RTS games out there that we're not seeing.
And we're just terribly uneducated. Yeah.
Right? I mean, we can only play so many video games or know so many things. So it goes.
I only play Baldur's Gate, so I have no clue what video games there are out there.
You know, someday it would be really fun if you and I did a like a co-op Baldur's Gate. I think that would be super fun. But I should probably beat the game first.
Yeah. Okay. And now, after StarCraft, we get to Metal Fatigue. And I noticed that in my notes I have not written down where Metal Fatigue was published, and now I looked it up. And the cool thing about Metal Fatigue is that it is fully 3D, and it absolutely was only published 2 years after StarCraft, which was still a 2D game. And now, to get into Metal Fatigue, Metal Fatigue was made by a company that we already encountered, which is Psygnosis.
Oh, yeah.
Psygnosis, they made, as we have episodes about it, Lemmings and GTA. And as we learned in the Lemmings and GTA episode, Psygnosis were actually not into cute puzzle games, which Nintendo thought for a while after they saw Lemmings. But actually, Psygnosis they basically only want to make games about violence and gore and want to show as much blood as possible on the screen.
Sure.
And Metal Fatigue is kind of in line with that. Because in the game you control, like, you are this corporate faction, and most of the game is the usual real-time simulation gist. You have a map, you build stuff, you build units, you gather resources, you have to explore the map. But instead of soldiers, you have these huge mechs. And they can be edited, like in MechWarrior.
Oh.
And you can put different arms and torsos and legs on them. And the most fun part about it is that you can actually, when you defeat another mech, you can salvage it and just graft the other body parts onto your mech.
Oh, this is so really cool. This is so cool.
It's really visceral. And it had a lot of really advanced technology, because Psygnosis was already pretty good with 3D stuff. They did a lot of 3D stuff for Nintendo before, when they did that alien shoot 'em up game that was far too violent for Nintendo's taste, but they did it anyway.
Right.
It had like fully 3D graphics. It has impressive features, like you could tilt the camera and look at units from all sides, which was really cool. The vehicles would tilt with the terrain, and for a game in the year 2000, it's actually, I must say, it has pretty impressive technology just in the timeline of what developed when, video game wise. And yeah, that is Metal Fatigue. And this is basically how I made a Metal Fatigue episode for a friend of mine by talking for 2 hours about wargame history.
This episode is great. I think it has something for everyone. And I'm really glad you did it.
Yeah. One thing we can basically finalize this on. So Metal Fatigue is a great game. You can actually buy it on Steam. I recommend it. It looks cool. I played it a while. I would try it out. The last thing I wanted to do was to look at war games that are not for recreational use, but at still professional use that are used at the time. And there's a publisher called GMT Games. And they have like a whole variety of board games that try to simulate probable future conflicts.
Okay.
But they are not video games, they're actually board games. I didn't find any video games that try to simulate war. I read about some stuff that was used in the 70s and 80s to simulate certain war scenario on computers. But the only thing I found for today was the stuff by GMT Games, where there's like one game that simulates war in Iran and one game that simulates war in Korea and in Poland and India and Taiwan, like all the possible future theaters of war that hopefully not happen, but could possibly happen.
Let us hope that like remains a work of fiction.
Absolutely. And that is basically it. I have one source for a digital war game that was turned into a recreational one. In the 70s and 80s, there was this game in the Navy called SeaTac and NAVTAC, and it was adapted to a recreational war game by a friend of Tom Clancy, who was called Larry Bond. And he turned it into a game that was called Harpoon, which was about sea warfare. And I think this is all the things I wanted to say in the end. And this is my entire wargame episode. This was the episode about wargames. Do you have any concluding thoughts about all that stuff I just said?
So I think that what you did in this episode is something that I always find to be really interesting, is how, this is very, very broad, but like all of human history in many ways is built on what came before, right? In ways that you don't often think about. Right? So when I go, man, I loved StarCraft, like totally changed my life as a teenager. And when I think about how, I might not have had StarCraft if some guy didn't end up becoming friends with a general and then lose his job when a prince died, like hundreds of years previous. Like, I think that stuff is pretty cool. So that's what sticks out to me. And also, like, I was really fascinated by you talking about how, like, they were used as a teaching tool. And then, people didn't really pay them much mind until they started losing wars. That was fascinating to me too, right? Because you're kind of like forced to then reconcile with those kind of things. So yeah, that's what sticks out to me as really cool. That was a lot of fun.
What I think that it's basically, if Helwig and George wouldn't have done it, I think someone else would have, because I think the basic idea of it in this environment of constant war in combination with the Enlightenment movement and scientific advancement, the idea of getting better teaching methods was kind of inevitable. So I think the war game was coming if you wanted or not. And I don't have evidence that Reiswitz was directly inspired by John Helwig. And these chains of influence are probably infinitely complicated. But I think having this simplified timeline gives us an easier time, because I was thinking about doing longer episodes simply about real-time simulation games like Command & Conquer. Gives us a very good basis. So this is basically like the college course that you have to visit before you can do the college course on Command & Conquer and StarCraft, the cool stuff. So if you listen to this, we will allow you to listen to the next real-time simulation and wargame episodes.
Yeah,
you have to hand in your assignment before the 1st of January.
It's true. And if you fail, then you're going to have to do it again. You're going to have to come back and listen to this. I want to hear
listen to the entire episode one more time. And the next test is going to be harder.
Mm-hmm. Dachz, what race do you think I played in? What race do you think I played in StarCraft?
You're not a Zerg, which is not a compliment.
Okay, so you're close.
I think you're a Protoss.
Oh, I'm so a Protoss player. Absolutely, I was a Protoss
definitely.
player.
I mean, don't you play Tau?
I do.
So you have to play Protoss, right?
Yeah.
So
There's actually
I always played Zerg.
I can
Zerg
see
all
it.
the way.
Yeah, you're a Zerg player for sure. Oh, I was totally a Protoss player. I very much liked the heavy, expensive units that you could do a lot with if you micromanage them well. But I like to say
They
that,
were
but
so strong. Yeah.
but I like to say that, but what I really mean is that I really like to just make a big death ball that no one could stop, and then I would just, click the whole thing and send
I just
it in.
have to reiterate what a good game StarCraft 1 was. And the multiplayer community, fuck, the modded maps, that was insane.
It really was. It was just so nuts what people managed to create with that.
Yeah. I'm so sad that it doesn't exist anymore. Because
Yeah.
it's not the same.
That's true. I mean, well, Blizzard just keeps killing all of their intellectual property, but that's a sad place to leave this episode. So, Dachz, thank you so much for this. This was fun, and I love Dachz episodes because you and I conceptualize what an episode can be and how we would think about an episode in very different ways. And so your episodes very much break the mold compared to mine. So I always really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was very fun to record another one.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's it for us. See you all in 8 months when we do another one of these.
Probably. Oh my goodness.
Be good to each other out there, and drop us a line sometimes. We love to hear from people.
See you around, guys. Bye.
Catch you later. Andre will fix it. Andre's gonna fix it. Here he comes with his magical software. Andre's gonna fix it. Andre's gonna fix it. Here he comes with his magical software. Andre's
My
gonna
cat's
fix it.
looking at me funny. Funny cat looking at me. It's a cat that's looking funny. Funny cat.
Okay, shall we Super Mario Brothers it?
Okay.
So is this the part where we hit stop? Do we hit stop at this point? Oh God. Okay, I'm gonna hit stop. I'm very scared.